Most people step onto the spiritual path, believing that if they just work hard enough, practice long enough, or collect enough wisdom, awakening will finally arrive like a diploma after years of study. The irony is that, for many, the more they chase it, the further it slips away. That is the hidden trap of spiritual awakening. The act of seeking can become the very barrier to finding. You see it everywhere in modern spiritual culture. Retreat certificates framed on the wall, meditation apps, tracking endless streaks like fitness badges, coaches charging hundreds of dollars for the latest technique that promises a shortcut to enlightenment. All of it creates the illusion of progress, but leaves people feeling more restless than ever. The ladder gets taller, the climb steeper, and the summit always out of reach. But what if the truth is far stranger and far closer than we imagine? What if awakening is not something to accumulate, not a prize to win, but something already present beneath our frantic searching? The question is not how much more you can do, but whether you can recognize what has always been there. And this is where curiosity takes hold. If the old models of progress and achievement cannot deliver, then what are we really talking about when we speak of awakening? What are these higher spiritual dimensions that sages and mystics have whispered about for centuries? And more importantly, what would it mean to discover that you have been standing in them all along? Imagine climbing a mountain with every ounce of your energy, convinced that somewhere above the clouds, a hidden temple is waiting, holding the key to enlightenment. Step after step, you measure your progress. You compare how many feet you've gained against the climbers around you. You collect little victories, a retreat certificate here, a meditation streak there, hoping one day the universe will stamp your passport and declare you awakened. And then, one day, breathless and exhausted, you look down and realize the summit you were searching for has always been under your feet. You were standing on sacred ground all along. That is the cruel joke of seeking. The moment we tell ourselves we need to transcend, we create the very separation that blinds us from what we are. The seeker is born out of the search, and once the seeker exists, the game never ends. There is always another practice to perfect, another book to underline, another workshop to sign up for. It feels productive, even noble, but beneath it lies the same addiction, the quiet assumption that you are broken and must be fixed. Our culture has turned spirituality into a marketplace. Apps count your breaths, the way fitness trackers count your steps. Gurus sell energy upgrades, like they're the latest software patch. Retreats advertise themselves as existential tourism, promising visions and breakthroughs you can post about when you come back. And in this frenzy of consumption, the original point is lost. Awakening doesn't need a receipt. It doesn't come with fanfare. It isn't something delivered overnight like a package on your doorstep. I know because I lived that addiction. 15 years spent chasing the next method, convincing myself that this time, this teacher, this practice would finally unlock the door. Instead, every tool became another set of chains. The meditation cushion I sat on for hours turned into a prison. The identity of being a seeker became the very mask that blocked me from seeing what had always been there. This is where the shock comes in. The realization that what you thought was helping you might actually be holding you back. The hours of discipline, the shelves of highlighted books, the proud tally of silent retreats, all of it can harden into a wall between you and the very thing you're longing for. It's like trying to use darkness to create light. The harder you push, the further it slips away. And yet, this moment of disillusionment is also a doorway. When the striving collapses, even for a second, something unexpected breaks through. You catch a glimpse of the simple fact that awakening was never absent. It doesn't need to be achieved, because it isn't a product of achievement. It is what remains when the machinery of seeking winds down. For many viewers, this is the first shockwave of truth, to realize that the tools we clutch so tightly, our journals, our mantras, our perfectly arranged meditation spaces, are not passports to higher dimensions, but reminders of how desperately we want to arrive. And the cruelest irony, There was never anywhere else to get to. So the question isn't how many retreats you've attended or how many years you've meditated. The real question is, are you willing to stop climbing long enough to notice the ground beneath you? Because sometimes the only way out of the seeker's trap is not another step upward, but the quiet courage to stand still. Neville Goddard had a way of turning the entire conversation about spirituality on its head. While most teachers spoke of effort, discipline, and the long road of practice, Neville's message was disarmingly simple. What you assume to be true becomes the reality you live, not in the sense of daydreaming or pretending, but in a far deeper sense. The world outside bends to the state of consciousness you occupy inside. Think about it like this. People spend years hunting for their glasses, frustrated, searching every corner of the house, only to realize they were perched on their head the entire time. That's the irony Neville pointed out. The harder you search out there, the more blind you become to the truth that was already resting with you. The assumption is the glasses you didn't need to find them. You just needed to remember you were already wearing them. This is where the Kybalion quietly enters the story. An old Hermetic text, often dismissed as too abstract, contains a principle that unlocks Neville's insight. As above, so below. As within, so without. It is not just mystical poetry, it's the mechanics of reality itself. Your inner state is the template, the mold from which the outer world is cast. Change the assumption at the core of your being, and the mirror of life cannot help but reflect it back. We've been trained to think of spirituality as climbing a ladder. Practice leads to progress. Progress leads to glimpses. Glimpses lead to awakening. But Neville's fourth dimensional key tears that ladder down. He tells you the entire structure is an illusion. You don't climb into a higher dimension, you slip into it by assuming its truth is already alive in you. It's not about effort, but alignment. When you hear this, something inside stirs. It's both liberating and unsettling, because it means no guru can hand it to you, no certificate can prove it, and no amount of hours logged on a meditation app can guarantee it. The key is in your pocket. The question is whether you believe it enough to use it. This hidden truth from the Kybalion and Neville's radical teaching reveals why so many seekers remain trapped. They're still behaving as if reality is outside of them, when the law itself says otherwise. To live by assumption is to step into the fourth dimension, not as an idea, but as a living experience. And when you do, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. A casual conversation becomes a mirror of your deepest belief. A coincidence on the street becomes a synchrony, confirming the state you've chosen to embody. Suddenly, you're not just reading ancient words, you are walking proof of them. That's when the Kybalion stops being a dusty book and starts breathing through your very life. There is a moment on the path that feels less like revelation and more like demolition. Everything you thought defined you, your career, your relationships, your carefully polished image of who I am, suddenly begins to unravel. At first, it feels like failure, like something has gone terribly wrong. But in truth, this collapse of identity is one of the most sacred initiations on the spiritual journey. Sarah's story makes this clear. For years, she built her life around being the high-achieving professional, the one everyone could count on, the one who never dropped the ball. Her worth was measured in productivity and reputation. Then, without warning, she found herself unable to continue. The drive that had once powered her simply evaporated. Meetings became unbearable. Small talk, impossible. And the mask of competence that once fit so tightly now felt suffocating. To her, it seemed like her life was falling apart. In reality, it was her false identity, dissolving. Marcus went through something different, but just as profound. His identity was built on being the rock for his family, the problem solver, the dependable one who always had the answers. But as his inner world began to shift, he could no longer play the role. He stopped reacting the way he used to. He began sitting in silence when arguments erupted, not out of withdrawal, but because the old scripts no longer made sense. His family thought he had lost his edge. What he had actually lost was the compulsion to keep proving himself. This is what identity collapse feels like. Terrifying, disorienting, even humiliating. Friends may say, "You've changed," as if it's a bad thing. Family may push back, demanding you return to the roles that made them comfortable. And inside, you may hear the panicked voice whispering that you are broken, that you've lost your way. But look closer. What if the disorientation is not a mistake, but a signal? In many traditions, this moment is called the little death. It's not the end of life, but the end of the mask. The self you worked so hard to polish cannot cross the threshold into higher awareness. It must dissolve, like a cocoon splitting open, to make way for what's been waiting all along. What dies is the actor's costume. What remains is the actor finally free to step into the light without disguise. It's important to understand that collapse is not the same as destruction. Collapse clears space. When the scaffolding of identity falls away, you discover a silence underneath one that has been there the whole time. That silence is not empty. It is alive, steady, and unshaken by the storms on the surface. It is what many describe as the true self. For those watching, the fear is real. It feels like losing control, like losing everything. Yet the paradox is that only by losing the illusion of control can you encounter the ground that never shifts. This is why so many who endure identity collapse emerge with a strange calm, a deeper clarity. Even though their outer life may look messy, they realize the collapse was not punishment, but initiation, a rite of passage into authenticity. So if you find yourself in this storm unable to perform the roles you once wore with ease, feeling stripped and exposed, take heart. You are not failing, you are being initiated. The collapse is not evidence that you're lost, but proof that the old shell is cracking open. What waits on the other side is not another identity to cling to, but the freedom of no longer needing one. That's the hidden truth of awakening. Sometimes, it begins not with light flooding in, but with the lights going out, and in that darkness, the old self falls away so the real one can finally breathe. When the roles finally dissolve, what is left behind is not a void, but a quiet watcher. The observer is not something you create or achieve. It is what remains once the costumes are stripped away. At first, it feels almost unsettling, as if you're hovering just outside your own life. You still go to work. You still eat dinner with your family. You still pay bills and run errands. But everything carries a different texture. The heaviness of attachment loosens. The constant pressure to perform begins to lift. What's left is a strange lightness, the relief of realizing you were never trapped by life itself, only by the way you held it. This awakening of the observer is not about withdrawing from reality. It is about seeing it more clearly. The argument at the dinner table that used to ignite your temper now appears like a passing weather front. The fear of failure that once kept you awake at night now seems like a cloud drifting across an endless sky. Life still happens, but it doesn't own you in the same way. You are no longer drowning in every storm. You are the wide ocean beneath it. Understanding higher dimensions begins here, not with abstract theories, but with a shift in perspective. Imagine trying to explain depth to a flatlander who has only ever seen length and width. The observer is the part of you that finally senses the third axis, the unseen depth of being. In higher awareness, your daily struggles don't vanish, but they are recontextualized. They no longer define you. They become movements within a larger field of meaning. The Kybalion describes this shift through the principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as within, so without. To the observer, this isn't just philosophy, it's daily experience. The chaos outside begins to mirror the state inside, and as your inner ground grows steadier, the outer reflections soften. You realize you were never truly lost. You had only forgotten you were already home. This realization brings a kind of healing that effort could never deliver. Instead of chasing after a perfect version of yourself, you begin to rest in what has always been whole. Instead of trying to fix every problem before you can feel peace, You discover a peace that exists even in the midst of problems. And in that resting, the world itself seems to breathe easier around you. The observer does not need to control or manipulate. Its presence alone changes everything. It's the quiet shift from struggling to hold your life together to noticing that life is already holding you. That is the essence of understanding higher dimensions, not escaping this world, but perceiving it with new eyes. One of the most liberating shifts after awakening is not mystical at all. It is biological. For the first time, emotions that once dragged you under lose their grip. Anger still arises, fear still stirs, sadness still washes over, but they no longer consume you. You don't drown in them. You notice them. You allow them, and you choose your response. This is not suppression. It is freedom. Modern science helps us see why this happens. The polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, describes how the vagus nerve acts like a switchboard between your body and your awareness. In survival mode, the nervous system locks you into fight, flight, or freeze. Every trigger feels like a threat, every setback like a crisis. But as your inner state stabilizes, the vagus shifts. It begins to send signals of safety instead of alarm, opening up what researchers call adaptive flexibility. In other words, your system learns that you can face the storm without being swept away. This is where consciousness expands, not because you have discovered new information, but because your field of perception is no longer hijacked by panic. You start to see the bigger picture. A cutting remark from a colleague is not an attack on your soul. It's a wave passing across the surface of the ocean. A moment of fear before a big decision is not a prophecy of failure. It's a cloud moving through the sky. Meta-perception, the ability to witness thoughts and feelings like weather, turns your mind into vast open space instead of a cramped room. The Kybalion hints at this when it teaches that vibration is the key to transformation. By shifting your internal state, you shift the field of your experience. Neville Goddard called it assumption. Jung might call it individuation. Science calls it neuroplasticity. The brain literally rewiring itself to stabilize new patterns. The language differs, but the essence is the same. Freedom at the nervous system level unlocks expansion at the level of awareness. What makes this shift so healing is that it doesn't require perfection. You don't need to banish anger or erase fear. Instead, you learn to hold them differently. They are no longer chains binding you, but messengers passing through. Each time you remain steady in the face of a storm, your system encodes a new memory. I can handle this. Over time, that memory becomes your default setting. Expanding consciousness, then, is not an escape from humanity. It is a deeper embodiment of it. You discover that being human is not a flaw to overcome, but the very ground where awakening takes root. Emotions remain. Storms still come, but they no longer define the horizon. You are the sky, not the weather. And once you recognize yourself as the sky, there is no limit to how wide your awareness can grow. Try for a moment to imagine explaining depth to a person who has lived their whole life in a flat world. They know length and width, but the idea of up and down is impossible to grasp. That is exactly what it feels like when we try to speak about higher dimensions from inside our three-dimensional perspective. We point, we guess, we use metaphors, and yet, sometimes, a glimpse breaks through. The first glimpse often comes as a shock, a conversation that feels eerily familiar, as if you had lived it before, a dream that later plays out in exact detail, a coincidence so sharp you cannot dismiss it. These are hints of what Neville Goddard called the fourth dimension, a reality in which past, present, and future are not lined up in a row, but exist all at once, layered over each other like pages of a single book. You flip to a page and call it today, but the entire story already exists in your hands. Modern physics has its own name for this idea, the block universe. According to this view, time is not a river carrying us forward. It is a landscape in which every moment simply is. What we call past is one coordinate. What we call future is another. We walk through it, slice by slice. But the whole terrain already exists. Quantum experiments, like those led by Anton Zeilinger's team, even suggest that the way we choose to observe can determine how an event appears, as if choice echoes backward as well as forward. Neville pushed this truth further into the realm of personal experience. He said the key was assumption. Don't just visualize what you want, embody it. Step into the state where your desire is already fulfilled, and life will bend to reflect it. In the block universe, you aren't creating something out of nothing. You are tuning your awareness to the page where that version of your life is already written. This is where awe takes over. Time stops feeling like a prison and begins to feel like a canvas. Every moment is not a door that disappears when closed, but a thread woven into a vast tapestry. To expand into higher dimensions is to realize you are not trapped on a single track. You are free to move, to align, to assume the state that reveals a different slice of the eternal now. And when you begin to live this way, life feels almost surreal. Problems don't vanish, but they lose their stranglehold. Delays feel less like punishments and more like cues that you are still aligning your state. Synchronicities increase, not because the universe suddenly noticed you, but because you finally tuned into the frequency where meaning was always shimmering. This is the Neville Goddard truth. Higher dimensional vision is not an abstract idea, but a lived reality available to anyone willing to stop treating time as a straight line. When you embody the fulfilled desire, when you rest as if it is already true, you step into the fourth dimension. You stop chasing tomorrow and start living inside eternity. One of the most persistent myths about awakening is that once you arrive, life smooths itself out. The job becomes secure, relationships grow effortless, your health glows, and the universe opens a VIP lane just for you. But those who walk the path honestly will tell you something very different. Problems don't vanish after awakening. In fact, they often intensify. The difference is not in what happens to you, but in how you see it. Think of the moments when life broke you open, losing a job you thought defined you, watching a relationship crumble despite your best efforts, hearing the doctor deliver news that stopped your world cold. Before awakening, these events feel like pure punishment. They fuel anger, despair, and the haunting belief that the universe is against you. But when your awareness shifts, these same events transform. They no longer read as random cruelty. They become curriculum. Every crisis carries a hidden syllabus, a lesson tailored for the growth of your soul. Sarah once believed that her career collapse meant she had failed as a person. After awakening, she looked back and saw it differently. The collapse had been the only way for her to shed an identity that was suffocating her spirit. Marcus once cursed the end of his marriage. Later, he realized that the pain had been a passage, teaching him how to stand in authenticity instead of clinging to a role. What once felt like chaos revealed itself as pattern. This is the alchemy of problems, the ability to hold suffering in a new light until it reveals its gold. Just as alchemists of old tried to turn base metals into treasure, awakening teaches you to transmute crisis into initiation. You discover that the breakdown is not an ending but a threshold. What looks like destruction is often the soul's way of preparing you for a life you could not have imagined. Even synchronicities begin to multiply in these moments. Just when the weight of loss feels unbearable, a stranger's words echo the very insight you needed. Just when you think you've reached the end, a door opens in an unexpected place. These signs don't erase the pain, but they whisper a deeper reassurance. The universe has not abandoned you. It is guiding you through a pattern you are only beginning to see. Does spiritual awakening change reality? Yes and no. It doesn't erase the storms, but it changes the way you walk through them. You begin to see the geometry behind the chaos, the design hidden in what once felt like senseless suffering. And in that recognition, hope sneaks back in. You realize you are not cursed but initiated. You are not being punished, but prepared. When you carry this perspective, the next crisis no longer feels like proof of failure. It feels like an invitation. You still feel the grief, the fear, the sting of loss, but beneath it all hums a quiet confidence. This, too, is part of the path. And that confidence is the real treasure of awakening. One of the most painful surprises of spiritual growth is not the inner turbulence, it's the outer fallout. When your frequency shifts, the relationships that once defined your world often begin to fall apart. People who felt essential suddenly feel unbearable. Conversations that once flowed now sound hollow, even toxic. The same friends who cheered your progress may accuse you of betrayal. Family members may push back, demanding you return to the role they depended on. And at first, it cuts deeply. It feels like loss. It feels like rejection. But here is the hidden truth. Spiritual evolution always involves exit. Just as cells divide and old skin sheds, certain connections must break so others can emerge. Energy vampires, the ones who drained you with endless drama, slip away, sometimes violently. Drama addicts who thrived on your old wounds find no fuel in your new silence. To them, you seem cold, distant, maybe even arrogant. To you, it feels like breathing clean air for the first time in years. The hardest part is when this shift happens inside the family. Parents, siblings, or partners may misinterpret your awakening as abandonment. They see your refusal to play the old part as rebellion, and their pain often lashes out as blame. This is where many seekers stumble, because the guilt can be overwhelming. You wonder, am I wrong for changing? Am I betraying the people I love? But evolution is not betrayal, it is transformation. A caterpillar does not betray the leaf by becoming a butterfly. It simply outgrows what once sustained it. And here lies the gift on the other side of the grief. Soul-to-soul connections. These are the relationships born not of dependency or habit, but of resonance. Conversations that cut straight to the marrow. Companions who don't need you to perform, who recognize your presence as enough. They may be fewer in number, but they carry the depth of lifetimes. When you meet them, something inside whispers, I have known you before. This is the bittersweet pattern of awakening. Exit makes space for entrance. Every person who drifts away creates room for a new connection, tuned to your frequency. The loss hurts, but the healing that follows is real. You stop clinging to who you were and begin walking with those who meet you as you are. So if you are in the season of watching people leave, take heart. It is not failure. It is not proof that you are unlovable. It is the natural rhythm of spiritual evolution. To let go, to make room, to step into relationships that reflect not your old wounds, but your new wholeness. Evolution equals exit, and sometimes the most loving act for yourself and for others is to let the timing be right. Not everyone is called to sit on a mountaintop or speak to crowds in flowing robes. In fact, most of the time, awakening does not announce itself with trumpets. It moves quietly, almost invisibly, through the texture of daily life. And the surprising truth is this: your presence alone, when it is rooted in authenticity, can serve the world more powerfully than 1,000 lectures. Think about the last time you stood in line at the grocery store. Maybe the cashier was exhausted, the person in front of you impatient, the energy heavy and restless. In that moment, you didn't need to quote a sacred text or preach about consciousness. You simply needed to be steady, to meet each glance with calm. Your nervous system, regulated and clear, becomes a subtle lighthouse. Without saying a word, you shift the atmosphere. Someone exhales, someone smiles back, a ripple moves outward. This is what it means for the mind to stretch beyond physical matter. Presence isn't confined to the body or the words you speak. It radiates through the field around you. Neuroscience calls this interpersonal regulation. Mystics call it aura. The language differs, but the effect is undeniable. People feel it when you walk into a room. The energy changes. not because you are trying to project something, but because you are no longer performing. You are simply being. This is the opposite of the guru trap. Awakening doesn't demand that you start a movement or gather followers. It asks only that you live truthfully, here and now. Your children feel it when you respond with patience instead of irritation. Your co-workers feel it when you refuse to feed gossip and instead hold steady ground. A stranger at a traffic light feels it when you soften instead of rage. These small moments are not small at all. They are the revolution expressed in micro form. The Kybalion teaches that the whole is in the part. Every authentic act, no matter how ordinary, reflects and influences the greater pattern. Neville Goddard echoed this truth. Assumption, embodied in one life, reshapes the collective fabric. And Jung would remind us that the psyche is not isolated, it participates in a deeper field of meaning. All of these traditions point to the same reality. Presence itself is contribution. What this means is liberating. You don't need to wait until you've figured it all out. You don't need to escape to a monastery or build a platform. Your daily life school runs. Office work, cooking dinner already holds the opportunity to serve. The way you show up is the teaching. And perhaps the greatest gift of all is realizing that being yourself, fully and honestly, is enough. You don't have to strive to impress, to control, or to fix the world. Your coherence, your willingness to stand as you are, becomes magnetic. People may not even know why they feel calmer around you, but they will. And in that way, without titles or stages, you become the quiet teacher the world has been waiting for. There is a danger that lurks even after the deepest glimpses of truth, and it is more subtle than all the others. It is the moment the ego sneaks back into the driver's seat wearing a new costume. Suddenly, the old voice that once said, "I am not enough," changes its script and whispers, "I am enlightened. I am above them." This is the spiritual ego, the most refined trap of all. The irony is cruel. After years of climbing, collapsing, and surrendering, you finally touch the stillness at the center of your being. For a while, it feels pure and freeing, but then the mind, desperate to reassert control, turns even that into an identity. You start comparing your awakening to others. You measure your silence against their noise, your detachment against their chaos, and before you realize it, you've built a new pedestal, higher than before, with the same bars disguised in gold. That is why the final test is never about one breakthrough moment. It is about surrender that never stops. Awakening isn't a medal to hang on your wall. It isn't a badge you flash at others to prove you've arrived. It is a practice of dying and being reborn every day, of releasing the grasping hand before it closes again. To live awakened is to remember, over and over, that you are not the role, not the mask, not even the awakened one. You are the presence beneath it all. Sarah understood this when people around her began to admire her calm, asking for advice, even treating her like a teacher. For a moment, she felt pride, the ego rising in a new disguise. But when she remembered the collapse that had humbled her, she chose to let the pedestal dissolve. She answered not as an authority, but as a companion. Marcus experienced the same shift. As his family adjusted to his new steadiness, they looked to him for leadership. Instead of feeding the role of guru, he used each moment to point them back to their own ground. Their awakening rippled outward, not because he claimed to have the answers, but because he refused to. This is the silent revolution at work. Collective consciousness doesn't rise through charismatic leaders demanding followers. It rises through ordinary people, refusing the trap of spiritual ego and choosing presence instead. Every act of humility plants a seed. Every refusal to grasp at superiority allows authenticity to breathe. And as more individuals embody this posture, something begins to happen at scale. Communities soften. Families transform. Strangers feel the difference in a room. So the final test is also the collective invitation to see that awakening is not about you alone. It was never meant to be hoarded. It was always about the field we create together. When enough people live without the need to prove themselves enlightened, the very air changes. What once felt like isolated sparks begin to form a constellation, a living network of awareness stretching across humanity. This is how the trap becomes the turning point. The ego may whisper, "You are the awakened one," but the truth is greater. We are awakening together. And when that realization takes root, the journey stops being a personal climb and becomes a shared revolution, quiet, steady, unstoppable. Awakening was never meant to be a private trophy. It is not something you win and guard in silence. Every shift in awareness, every collapse of an old mask, every breath taken in presence ripples outward. The steadiness you embody becomes steadiness for others. The clarity you carry becomes clarity for your community. Personal awakening is not separate from collective evolution. It is the very seed of it. So if something in this journey spoke to you, if a moment of recognition stirred in your chest, mark it, anchor it, write it in the comments with 3 simple words. I understood it, not as a badge of achievement, but as a signal, a resonance, a way of joining this silent revolution together. And remember, there is no final summit to reach, no diploma at the end of the road. Awakening is not a destination. It is the path itself, unfolding step by step, breath by breath. The story doesn't end here. It continues in you, in us, in the field we create together. The journey is infinite, and that is its beauty.